I was involved in an NIH-funded initiative focused a lot on preventing violence and promoting healthy behavior, but leveraging social emotional learning, and Mark Greenberg and the Fast Track group were involved in that. And we were working in the Chicago and the Aurora public schools to try to implement a teacher training, peer group, family intervention program, really relying a lot on the principles of social emotional learning. And the comments we would get is, well, you need to put this on the standardized test, or I can't really teach it, and what is this, and why am I doing this? And there was so much resistance, we were really frustrated. And I think thanks to the banner that Castle has really taken on and other groups, how things have changed when we fast forward 30 years and we see where we are today. It's just the global representation, the coverage around the US, the fact that all of you are here is really a testament to how much social emotional learning has changed. And kind of picking up on that theme, when I started in the field, it was really, I think, limited to preschool, elementary school, very little going on in middle school, high school, or beyond. And that's a dramatic shift. And how many of you are from middle schools or high schools here? So we see a huge, yes, applause for that, where it's very much needed for all of those. For all of you who teach in middle schools or have middle or high schoolers, you know that. I am also seeing it at the university level. It's starting to gain a foothold. I know there's a session on flourishing in the afternoon. At the University of California, Irvine, our School of Social Ecology has kind of taken the lead in this movement. And we have a Life 101, 102, 103, one-year sequence for undergraduates. We have a whole program in the science and practice of compassion, where students take coursework and they actually go do an international field study. We're starting with help from the Tarsidia Foundation, a Learn with Love movement, which a lot of my academic colleagues look at me and go, what? But we believe that at the university level, it needs to be infused, and we really see how that can change things. We're actually starting a corporate business service scholars program to work with corporations around education, around compassion and service, volunteer work, and then executive coaching on the job, how you infuse this. We're finding a lot of corporate leaders tell us that now they're getting these millennials who ask questions about what's your social impact? What are you doing for the common good? So we're obviously having an impact. And I was talking with someone this morning about maybe it's a little too slow to see progress, but it's a culture shift. We're really shifting the culture, the way people understand the world. And I think that transitions into a whole other area that social emotional learning has moved into, and that's the whole field of labor market, of soft skills, non-cognitive skills, all the work that we're trying to do, because employers are saying, we can teach how to run a machine. We can't teach how to delay gratification or how to show up on time and all of the skills that we want. And I was just mentioning a model that I was fortunate to work with the World Bank on, trying to take social emotional learning skills and kind of map on to what have been called non-cognitive, the big five. A lot of the economists and the multilaterals understand social emotional learning, but they don't quite call it that. And so we were using the idea of social literacy, social emotional skills. And what I did with my colleagues is we looked at over 50 studies of what employers want, because we thought, we need to be data-driven. And we sifted through, and we came up with 8 skills. And I know there are lots of frameworks and models. And I want to mention that I don't think we all need to agree on one. We just need to use a framework and a model that fits the context we're working in, and that has a decent acronym, so it's not a bougie or something that people are like, what is that? So we thought practice. We had to stretch a couple of skills because we wanted it to fit in an acronym that people could get. But I think you can see they capture a lot of the skills that employers said they want, and they build out a little bit beyond what's typically taught in our K-12 system. So things like communication. And I always say, as dean, I find probably the single most pressing challenge that we have is communication, because communication is so flawed, and I could give examples of that. But I think it's really important to see how we can take SEL, and I know Karen talked about this, and extended into all of these different domains, and then they all coalesce really for the common good. Building on the idea of data-driven, and let's kind of decide on what the important skills are from what the people who are actually seeing the need for them want, we thought it would be really important, and thanks to the wonderful team who's put this conference together, we thought, well, why don't we ask children? You know, we all talk about the skills that children need. We thought, why don't we see what children say are the important skills? And it's very interesting. I'm a developmental psychologist, so I would be remiss if I didn't say, you have to watch this through the lens of development and understand that for younger children, skills are related to rules in general. And I always like to give the example, when my son was about 7, we were playing Sorry, a board game, some of you know it. And it was late at night and I wanted to be done. So I said, why don't we just change the rules and we'll make this the rule? And my son looked at me and he said, Mom, we can't do that. And I said, why not? He goes, look at the back of the board, you know, of the carton. And he goes and gets it and he brings it to me. He goes, see, it's written right there. And I tried to explain to a 7-year-old, well, I know, but it's just written on cardboard. We can change it. And he just looked at me and said, no, we absolutely can't change the rule. And I had to play the whole game the way the rules were. So bear in mind, young children will be always talking about, you know, you have to do this or you'll get in trouble. This is the rule, you can't change it. The older children are much more sophisticated, and they talk about things like justice and equity and respect. So we asked children from around the country to answer 2 questions. What do you think students need to learn to be a good person? And how will that help them be successful when they finish school? So we want to turn now to the video. Thank you.
I think students need to learn to be open-minded because other people may have different opinions and that can cause problems. So students need to learn how to accept that. Another thing I think students need to learn is to be disciplined, because being disciplined in school can help you follow the rules and it can make you more organized in class.
I think students need to learn persistence to be better people.
They have to know how to be kind, how to make friends, and how to help others when they need it.
I think education is one of the best things a person needs in his life. When a person is educated, that person is different. The he talk, the he move, and all his action is very different like the others person who live on the street.
I think they need to learn how to be kind, courageous, and how to manage their emotions. What do you think, Theo?
I think that's good.
A persistência vai ajudá-los a nunca desistir, a dedicação a dar tudo de si pelo que estão fazendo e a disciplina a manter o controle. Persistence will help them never give up, dedication will help them commit themselves to what they're doing, and discipline will help them keep control at all times.
To work with other people and to care for other people.
Well, just because they're out of school doesn't mean they have to stop being respectful. Like, they still need to be respectful to their boss when they get a job. They need to be respectful to their community, including your family, and you also need to protect them too.
That was just amazing and, again, heartwarming. I'm just flooding with emotions here today. But it's now my great pleasure to welcome our 3 distinguished global speakers to the stage to provide you some insights from their work. So please come on stage, and then I'll introduce them. So on your left, we have Koji Miyamoto, who's a senior economist for the World Bank. He's from Japan. He was previously the project lead on a 9-country OECD study on social and emotional skills. He joins us from Washington, and I asked him to please tell everybody what OECD is, because we use a lot of acronyms and then explain a lot about the work. In the middle, we have Anantha Duraipa, who's the director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. He's an economist by training, and he joins us from New Delhi, India. And then on your right, we have Luca Perry, who is the CEO and founder of The Learning Future and serves on the executive committee of Karanga. He will also explain that. The Global Alliance for SEL and Life Skills, and he has experience as a classroom teacher and school principal, and he's traveled from Melbourne, Australia. So welcome to our panelists, please. So now I'd like you all for a moment to just kind of reflect on the videos and kind of think about your reaction to the insights. Did it make you think about something in your work? Kind of how did it affect you in some way? And I'm going to move over here because we want this to be more of a conversation. And I'm going to ask our panelists actually to reflect on this. There's X's. I don't know what they're for, but I'll sit here. So why don't we start with Koji and just kind of give us some words of wisdom or reflections on watching the videos.
Thanks, Nancy. I think, these were brilliant comments from the children. I think these children are doing a great job inspiring us to do a much better work to improve and promote SEL, not just in the US, but around the world. Now, these children may look different. These children may come from totally different circumstances, backgrounds. But what's clear from the video is that they share very common perspectives on what constitutes a good person. And that's quite amazing, because it's such a subjective question. And you hear common comments like kindness, persistence, discipline. I, for myself, I've had the pleasure to talk to many children from around the world, from a student in highly advanced schools in South Korea, supported by Samsung, to students who are attending refugee camps in Uganda. And I can assure you that many of the aspects of a good person that these children shared in the video are also something similar to what these children from other parts of the world said. Now, I just wanted to also mention that, while there may be a common set of social and emotional skills that children tend to value, but perhaps, the way to develop these skills can vary considerably, according to where you are, where you're from, the social and cultural norms, and the societal expectation of what schools and teachers should do. Okay? And some of these topics I think we'll probably touch upon later in this discussion.
Thank you. Anantha, what was your reaction?
When I was listening to the children, it brought to my attention that, as adults, as decision makers in the education sector, we still continue to make the fundamental error. In a sense, we don't listen to the consumer. This is the first and only sector that, as an economist, I'm saying, is that we don't listen to the consumer. And the consumer is the students, and they always get it right. I just think back on my own personal journey where my oldest son, who in very early days was telling us there was a problem, and yet we never listened. And the school systems were trying to push him into a system that he was not well equipped. And then later, at the age of 8, he was diagnosed with acute dyslexia. But he was telling us there was something wrong at a much earlier stage, and we didn't listen. And I think that the fundamental message I take back from this case is, let's listen to the children. We think that they're too young, but they actually really know what they want to. Of course, with certain guidance, we're not just letting them decide the whole future, but at least let's sit back and listen to what they have to say, and what they had to say were very good things.
Yeah, amazing.
I mean, you can't help but feel optimistic when you listen to children speak about what they want for their own futures and what they want for the future of the world. It's what drew me to education in the first place. So that's how I feel, is optimistic. What do I think? Well, as Anantha, I think, has pointed out beautifully, how do we truly see and value other people, particularly children? We ask them. We actually ask them, what is it that you want? What is it that you think? What is it that you need right now? And so when we actually ask kids, we activate them as change makers, as agents in their own life. And I think that's, I mean, if there's anything we can do, it's actually ensure that when we are having discussions as educators, as policymakers, it's that young people are represented in that conversation, because they are the users of the product. I mean, they are the people that we are all in service of here. So it's always inspiring to listen to young people speak, because they have this kind of innocent curiosity about what they hope for the world. And I think we need to bring that into our lives as adults as well, because it can empower us through our work.
And I think I'm just going to reflect on the reflections. I'm so glad you mentioned the idea of agency and empowerment, because, and I think a lot of what I've learned as a parent as well, it's so powerful to empower children to be agents of their own fate. I know for all of you who are parents, when I used to have to punish my children for something that they did, instead of just saying, you're punished, you're grounded for 2 weeks, I'd say, I have to punish you because you shouldn't do that and you need to learn right and wrong, but I'll let you help me set the punishment. What do you think it should be? And they'd always say it way worse than I was going to do. I should be grounded for 6 months. And so then I'd say, well, I understand, I appreciate you saying that, but how about 2 weeks? And they say, oh, thank you, Mom. So I could actually punish them, and they'd be thanking me, which is amazing, because in a way, reflecting on what we said, they were agents in their own life. And I know what I hear from children a lot, and children I've worked with around the world, is that they feel that they don't count, they don't have a voice, no one listens to them. And so I think it's really empowering to listen to them and let them, at some level, be involved in decisions that affect them. So with that, I'm going to shift, since we have such a distinguished set of panelists, to asking each person to tell us just a little bit about what they see happening globally in SEL, a little bit about some of the initiatives they've been involved in, and perhaps some concrete examples if they come to mind. So why don't we start with Koji?
Okay.
Thank you.
So I've had the fortune to witness global movements in social emotional learning around the world. But I should perhaps first highlight that SEL wasn't built in a day. We all know that SEL has always existed in different forms, both in the US and around the world. There's always been teachers, parents, youth leaders, and priests who cared about the importance of fostering the whole child. So just to say, the global movement probably started even a long time ago. But really, what really signifies the ongoing global movement, to me, is the surge of evidence-based SEL. I think that's, that is what I see happening around the world. And I would like to, congratulate Castle, for being the driver of that, by providing much-needed evidence base. What works to the, to not only to the stakeholders in the US, but also to the global community. I should also mention that the global movement can also be characterized as, by the surge of measurement, measurement initiatives to capture, the so-called hard-to-measure skills, right? So those are the trends that I see that's happening. Now, just to give you some, more personal, concrete experience that I had, I picked, 2 countries that I know well. One is my home country, Japan, and another country is in Africa called Uganda. So you can see on the PowerPoint, a typical scene of social and emotional learning that happens in Japan. Maybe the students, from the middle schools may be horrified to see that, in Japan, social and emotional learning takes, in a form of cleaning the classrooms and the whole school. and also participating in preparing school meals. And this happens almost every day in Japan. And this happens in almost each and every school in Japan. Now, of course, the schools don't do this because they want to reduce the number of janitors or school meal staffs. No. In Japan, schools do this. Teachers promote this because this is an excellent way to foster, the spirit of collaboration, caring, taking responsibility, being organized. And so this is one very typical example. Maybe you haven't seen this kind of example before from a country like Japan. And I would say this initiative was started a long time ago. There was no Castle report that we could look into to develop this. So it's not based on evidence-based, but many of the principles behind this is actually evidence-based. You can see a lot of the underlying principles of delivering these programs also highlighted in the reports that Castle produces. Let me show you another example, which is Uganda, which I have recently started working on. So Uganda, is a country where there's lots of societal problems, including violence. Violence is one of the major societal challenges. And unfortunately, violence also happens in school. Now, the particular feature of Uganda is that it's not only the violence doesn't happen between students and students or from students to teachers, but much of the violence happens from teachers to student, so corporal punishment. So in a country like Uganda, there's a strong need for social and emotional learning that not only touches, the students, promotes students' sense of caring, empathy, but also we need to also address the issue of teachers, the teachers' capacity to understand the importance of positive discipline, how to implement that in a socially, emotionally nurturing way in curricular activities and extracurricular activities. So the last point about Uganda is that, fortunately, the Uganda built, a very leading NGO in Uganda called Raising Voices, created a fantastic social emotional learning program that is built on evidence. It's evidence-based. They also measure the progress of delivering this program to counter violence, to see, if it's effective, how we can do better. So I thought this is a very good example to show you that evidence-based SEL is gradually expanding around the world. And I should say again, all the insights that Castle has provided has been really helpful for the global community.
Thank you, Koji. Very insightful. So, Anantha, maybe you can give us a little bit about your perspective on the global movement and how to influence the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Nancy. So I'll try to make 3 points very quickly. Starting off with the SDG, I have the lights, I'm like a deer with the headlights.
I know, it's tricky up here.
I just want to see how many people have heard of the SDGs with a show of hands. We still have lots of work to do. Right. Well, these were 17 ambitious goals which were adopted by 193 countries in 2015. And they're ambitious, something that's required. What's very different of the SDGs is that it's relevant for every country. It's not a development agenda anymore just for developing countries, but it's relevant for every country. And I thought that was a major shift in the right direction. I want to go now to SDG 4. And if you look at SDG 4, this is on education, you got quality education. 3 words that I want you to focus on is quality, inclusive, and equity. But what we actually at the Institute have been struggling with is, have we really put, in a sense of getting the momentum, this global momentum, have we really put the cart in front of the horse? Because we really haven't asked the question, what type of education? What is education that we are striving for? And so I want to draw on, yesterday, October 2nd, was the 150th birth anniversary of Gandhi. And the institute is named after Gandhi, and we had a very interesting event in Paris 2 nights ago where we actually created a hologram of Gandhi and we had a dialogue with him. And I wanted to say a quote of Gandhi on education. People have no idea what education truly is. We assess the value of education in the same manner as we assess the value of land or shares in the stock market. We want to provide only such education as would enable the student to earn more. We hardly give any thought to the improvement of the character of the educated. So it was very critical 80 years ago, and I think it was still valid as of 2 nights ago when we had this discussion. And so we need to understand what the goal is, rather than moving away from what we have focused on human capital development for the last 40, 50 years, to one we think of more of a human flourishing. And this is where social-emotional learning really lends itself well, because that's the tool that we have to, bringing the cognitive and the social and emotional together, because they work in tandem. So saying that, I'm a little bit weary, because as we've been working on social-emotional frameworks, we see that there's been a proliferation of frameworks. Everybody's now saying, it's the bandwagon effect. We are doing social-emotional learning, and then when we look at it, it's about, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's good, but, it needs more. So the thing that Koji talked about, evidence, science-based, this is very important, and I think a group like this actually should take the lead in making sure what are the key characteristics, what are some of the basic key characteristics that if you want to define that you're doing social-emotional learning, it should. I'm not talking about regulating it. I think it should be just in terms of guidelines, some guidance, and that will be very helpful. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Luca, final?
Fantastic comments. To add upon, I would there's a great line by Aristotle, and I'll call on my Greek heritage, which is educating the head without educating the heart is no education at all. And I think for a long time, and Anantha and Koji have both picked up this point, we have this economic paradigm. And if we go back to what the kids said in the video, none of them said, so that I can have a good job. I mean, one of them mentioned job, but that was in the context of being respectful. Everybody else kind of goes well beyond what it means to be educated. And I think for a long time we've been schooling kids, for a particular outcome, which is so that they can participate in the economic paradigm. And yet, really, I don't think any of us here in this room in particular would say the sole purpose of education is to prepare someone for a job. We know that it goes well beyond that. And I think that's what we're pleasingly seeing. And Karen is absolutely right that now is one of the moments for this movement, I think, globally. In all of the conversations that I've been lucky to participate in, we're even seeing the business community come on board. 9 out of 10 companies are saying we need employees with soft skills. The other 1 in 10 probably won't be companies for much longer. Because really, we know that this is how we deal with AI, with the changing future of work, with the innovation capacity that we need, and some of the paradoxes we see around the world in every single community and society. The idea, how is it possible we can be the most connected we've ever been before, and yet be so lonely at the same time? I mean, the global burden of loneliness, of mental health challenges is incredibly significant. And the World Health Organization predicts it to be the single greatest global burden for health in the coming decade. So there's something that we're missing here. And I think partially we've been schooling kids, not trying to educate them in some of the deeper notions that we speak about here. So I think that's the opportunity that we all have, is we can be really active and big advocates for this work, but how can we try to connect the conversation at a global level? And that's really some of the work that I've been really lucky to work on with some phenomenal colleagues from across the world. About 35 on the steering committee, as we've built this organization, this not-for-profit called Karanga. And Karanga really is trying to be the global alliance for social emotional learning and life skills.
Can you say why you use the word Karanga?
Karanga actually is a Maori word, and it means a call out in welcome, a call out from the heart. Maori is the traditional language of New Zealand, Aotearoa, and it's just a beautiful concept. One of my colleagues is here, Joanne McKeegan, who's actually from New Zealand. Hello, Joanne. So the idea is to try to connect the ecosystem, to be a builder of the ecosystem. How can we do 4 things really well? Number 1 is to advocate for this work globally. Because even though we might be all on board with this movement, there are still particular spaces, particularly in companies where, in countries, I should say, where there isn't a lot of social emotional learning yet underway, where there still needs to be that advocacy piece taking place. The second thing we try to do at Karanga is to connect the global community together. So I just feel so grateful to be here amongst all of you, and yet there are still tens of millions of educators and hundreds of millions of children and young people that aren't yet aware of this movement, let alone actively participating in it. We also want to try to support the implementation of really rigorous, high-quality education through social emotional learning around the world. And finally, connect the research communities together. Because CASEL has been the lighthouse. You know, looking from outside into the US, really we can use CASEL as one of the lighthouses, a beacon for how you build an ecosystem around a movement. And yet, there still remains the opportunity to try to scale this work beyond. So most of the research, of course, has taken place here in the United States, and that's fantastic. But of course, what works, and as a practitioner, I know that this is always an incomplete question. What we need to ask is what works for whom, under what conditions, and when? With what dosage? What are the social and the cultural elements we need to bring into play? And I learned this firsthand, really, working with Australian Indigenous peoples, in which, being a Greek-Welsh Australian, working alongside the first Australians, it was abundantly clear we couldn't just take an urban program and then just kind of dump it into a regional or remote community. And so Karanga, that's really the offer that we have in some of our work, is to try to connect the global ecosystem. And so the call to action from us as a not-for-profit is to jump onto karanga.org and actually just try to join the movement. It really is a global decentralized movement that we're trying to create here to spark change, to amplify the great work we know is underway, particularly here in the US, and then ultimately to drive change, because we know that that's really important in today's world.
I'd like you all to think about what's been the biggest challenge for you in your work in SEL. What would you say if we could hear from everybody? And I wish we could, and I wish we had another 2 hours because it's such an amazing group. I'll say from my perspective, the biggest challenge has been that you really need to think about building blocks, and there are foundational needs, and then there are kind of, putting the walls up, and then there are decorating needs, and sometimes we jump ahead. I know when we did our project in Chicago Public Schools, we had a teacher training curriculum, and the teachers were on strike for the year, and so we didn't have teachers. So we thought, well, there's something wrong with this. But a lot of the international work I've done, there are very different standards of teacher credentialing. I worked in Honduras where you could buy your credential from your neighbor. I worked in Jamaica. And so I think you were mentioning the whole idea of training teachers and the need for professionalization of the teacher workforce around the world creates a barrier if you're trying to implement a program that they might not be ready for. And so that to me has been a big challenge, how you fit to different contexts with different levels of resource and readiness. So I'll turn it over to the panel though, and maybe if you could each take a minute or two to talk about some of the biggest challenges you've seen. So Koji?
Yes, I would first pick up on what you had just mentioned, to ensure, which partly relates to ensuring the quality of teachers to deliver a quality SEL in classrooms and also outside of classrooms as well. After seeing many SEL programs outside of the US, it's very clear that not all teachers are ready to deliver or to even learn about social emotional teaching in classrooms and other parts of the school. So I think we really need to make a lot of effort to improve the quality of SEL programs, which must have a strong component on teachers' training and teacher preparation. When you talk to many teachers in different countries, they also talk about, their struggles in grappling with everyday responsibilities, and that, they have limited space to engage in different ways of delivering the curricular activities, in spite of the fact that they are very sympathetic, motivated with the whole idea of social and emotional learning. So we must come with, a way to better integrate, the new methods into what they have been used to be doing for the past years. I just also want to mention another important point that I repeatedly see in as challenges facing SEL around the world. It's to ensure consistency of the learning environment across context. So SEL doesn't or shouldn't stop after the children leaves the school front door. SEL must continue after they go home, right? Yet, the fact of the reality is that there are a considerable proportion of parents who are, especially those who are vulnerable, disadvantaged backgrounds, have difficulties understanding, absorbing, and creating a nurturing environment at home. One would organize, teacher-parent meetings or provide information to parents. But of course, the parents who would be most, responsive to these, outreach are the parents that are already convinced and are already doing something. And typically, the parents that we really need to outreach are the parents that we can't, connect. So this is, repeatedly I found this, a challenge, especially when delivering SEL in disadvantaged settings in relatively poor countries in different parts of the world.
I think that's such a good point, and that would really be a challenge to all of you. I know I was doing some work in inner city schools in Lima, and we had some focus groups with the kids, and I said, what do you want to tell me? What advice would you give me? And probably 80% of the children said, could you teach my parents these skills? Mm-hmm. So clearly a need, and it's clearly an area that we've had a little bit more difficulty. So Anantha, do you have a challenge you might like to share?
Well, Koji has hit many of the points that I wanted to talk about, as well as Luca, but I think there are two that I would like to maybe pull out. One is policy incoherence within the education sector. So if you look at how policies on assessments, that's the one that drives. We manage what we can measure. And unfortunately, it's always with the assessments. So teachers are driven to produce, to provide the kind of curriculums for the assessments. When we go to many of the teachers in India, they kind of say, well, we have a pressure, we have to produce children, and the cutoff points are 99.9% for universities and stuff. So the pressure is there. There has to be some level, at the very highest level, of bringing in some coherence within that policy. I would like to see a day when assessments in the forms of exams, in my time, O-levels, A-levels under the British system, and then things like PISA, TIMSS are basically just got rid of. I know I'm hitting a nerve point here, but I really hate exams, and it doesn't really evaluate learning, and that has been shown again and again through a lot of studies, and we still keep using those. I'm not sort of saying we completely do away with assessments, but there needs to be policies where we do continuous monitoring and assessments where we really want to understand whether the child is learning rather than putting into a false environment to test whether the child has learned. The last one, I want to finish off by scale, because in India, I like to sort of just say we have 250 million students in K-12. 250 million students. When I go to the ministry and talk about studies of 1,000 students, they were like, Anantha, we have 250 million students. What are you talking about? You need to provide me with some options. And technology is something that I think is interesting. It's got some promises, and it sounds oxymoronic at the first to do social-emotional learning and technology, but there are studies which say that it's possible. And so we, at the Institute, we developed our own platform because we felt like with Google Classroom, and it wasn't providing the kind of initiatives that would provide for SEL. And we also have AI, because AI, I'm not sort of saying it's the gospel, that's the golden grail, but we have to use it carefully. But these are new frontiers that I would throw this challenge out to this group to sort of embrace and see how we can do scaling up, because it has to be scaled up. Thank you.
And I think with that, because I'm very rule compliant and I'm mindful of the time, I'm going to shift to opportunities. And you mentioned an opportunity being technology. So let's hear from Luca about what you see as really kind of closing comments and what our opportunities are for the next steps.
I think there's a few big movements. Number one, it's been mentioned a few times, particularly last night at the dinner, which is shifting from the individual to the collective. So yes, it's about being self-actualized, but it's also about self-transcendence. Yes, we want to embrace diversity, but we also want to acknowledge what are the common human values, the human principles that connect us all. And this is why there are some phenomenal movements, like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. As a practitioner, the opportunities are, my challenges are I'm time poor, my workload is really big, there's parents that I'm dealing with all the time, and then I have to support positive behavior. And so I think rather than having SEL as an add-on, as a top-down, the opportunity is to have it as a top-down and bottom-up approach. So supporting the ecosystem of educators so that we can do our best work consistently. Because it's pretty hard, we need to be able to model these things. We need these skills ourselves as educators. And so anyone that's working in the university sector that's really educating the new teachers of the future, we need to be trying to support this development throughout the kind of life cycle. I think that's a huge opportunity as well. And the last thing I'd say is we are part of a global movement. And I think, again, the paradox when you're working in a school in a really pro-social environment, sometimes you can feel so isolated. So I think it's to take kind of comfort that you are connected to a global movement of people really dedicated, who get up every single day and commit to teaching, to educating, to making the world better. And then the important part for all of us is to forgive ourselves when we don't deliver the best lesson ever because of the realities of schools and of communities. So there's a few, I think, things that we can take into our toolkits.
That's amazing. My challenge is to make the concluding comments in 12 seconds. So I think we've heard some great ideas from our distinguished speakers. I imagine many of you share in these challenges, and I hope we can embrace the opportunities. I certainly think the idea of a global movement, of leveraging technology, of expanding beyond schools to include families and policymakers, and really changing the way the world understands and incorporates social emotional learning. So thank you all.